Okay, welcome to our new Halacha series, Modern Medical Halacha. Starting tonight, hopefully it's going to cover many different topics. I have a whole list of different topics lined up, not just what we're going to start with today, dealing from things such as doctor reimbursement, medical priority, LGBTQI, LGBTQI, and any other letters I'm missing.
What's TQI?
Oh, let's not go with that now.
Okay. Trans?
Not now. All those issues, there is so much to deal with in modern medical halacha for the simple reason that technology and medicine moves so rapidly. There's so many shilas that have to be dealt with. I decided to start, as you can tell, with art-assisted reproductive technology in halacha, which is a general framework of IVF, etc., fertility treatments, genetic testing, which we'll deal with also, for the simple reason that we're in the middle of Shovavim, and Shovavim, the weeks of Shovavim in the winter, these are the days we classically focus on Taras HaMishpacha and related topics. So it sounds like a very good time to start dealing with a related topic, which is assisted reproductive technology, or ART as it's called. And so this is very relevant for a lot of reasons. First of all, if we're dealing with technology and medicine, assisted reproductive technology is really the cutting edge in many areas of medicine nowadays. That's A. B, because...
What's that term again?
Assisted reproductive technology, ART, A-R-T.
Isn't that's IVF in other words?
That includes a whole host of different things which we're going to discuss. Okay?
I didn't know there was anything else besides IVF.
I know, most people don't realize that. So there's a lot of things. So we're going to go through all of those in a second. But so, A, because of so many modern technologies, there are a lot of different shilas, a lot of nuances. Two, because it's something which is extremely relevant to us as Jewish people, especially as frum people, for the simple reason that we have a mitzvah pruvu, have at least a girl and a boy, if we can, obviously. We value children. Israel is the only, for example, only OECD country, only Western developed country, that has a birth rate above replacement value. In other words, in order for replacement value, you have to have 2.1 children, in theory, to replace the population with the next generation. Israel is the only country in the Western world now that has well above that, 3 point something, if I'm not mistaken. The States is low. There was actually just an article came out last week about that it's gone down. It's gone below replacement values. Yeah. Japan's population is in free fall. China, there was a news article yesterday that China is going to be losing population within the next 20 years already because they have the lowest birth rate they've ever had since Mao in the 60s. And that wasn't because of a low birth rate. That was because they all died. So they have such a low. So Israel is the only place because we value children. Israel also happens to be the place where, in the world, the only country in the world which finances such a high level or such a high number of IVF cycles. 4% of children born in Israel are born through IVF, which is unbelievable.
Is the only country?
Only country that gives fertility treatment up to the age of 45 or something like that free.
Only country in the world?
Yes. That's what I've read. I haven't checked every 190 whatever countries, but that's
what
I've read.
I'm not denying, I just didn't realize
Yeah.
that.
So there's something that we value about 4% of babies as of 2 years ago. 4% of babies born in Israel born through IVF, etc., which is a pretty staggering number. So this is obviously, for us, more than perhaps for other people, this is a very important technology and many repercussions and questions that come up in halacha. So I'm going to start with history. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So we're going to start with the history. Up to the 18th century, if you couldn't have, for whatever reason, unfortunately, you had a fertility issue, you had a fertility issue, and that was the way it was. There was nothing that could be done. Starting in the 18th century, we start finding Scottish surgeon John Hunter starting to experiment with injecting sperm into the woman to assist the sperm to get to the place where it needed to get to the fallopian tubes. We start seeing that in the 18th century. In the 19th century, the first, 1884 actually, in Philadelphia, the first artificial insemination, which we call nowadays IUI. Okay?
What's that mean, IUI?
Intrauterine insemination. Okay? That's the first. We'll explain. What?
Donor or husband?
Husbands. we're going to, there's many varieties, as we'll get to in a second. So that was the first, so we're talking about the end of the 19th century. That's the first live birth of using assisted reproductive technology. In this case, the woman stays with her eggs inside of her. Nothing happened there. All that was done was the injection of semen into the fallopian tubes to assist pregnancy, essentially to enable pregnancy.
Not into the fallopian tubes, into the uterus.
Into uterus. Well, usually, at the base of the fallopian tubes.
Okay.
Because you don't want ectopic pregnancy.
You don't want
100%. You're right. 100%. So the base. No. He's 100% right. Okay. 100% right. So at that point in time, the end of the 19th century, that's when the halachic shilas start appearing, and we're going to start going through those, because that's when all the questions appear as to, as we'll see in a second, what is the status of such a child? Is it mutter to do such a thing? Is it mutter to do it with someone else's sperm, etc., etc.? So we're talking about the end of the 19th century. But that isn't where it stops. That's IUI, okay? That's the first step. In the 1970s, the real first experiments, or real live experiments, with IVF began. IVF is in vitro fertilization. That means it happens, when I was a kid, I remember hearing about this, test tube babies. That's what it was known as originally. And I remember thinking it was absolutely hilarious that a baby was being born in a test tube, and I couldn't understand as a little kid what on earth was going on. Until a bit older, I actually understand what's going on. But so in the 1970s, that's when this first started, and the first IVF test tube baby was born in England in 1978. So it's all pretty recent technology. The 1980s is when everything really started taking off and everything developed. So in 1983, you have the first concept of egg donors. That is, when a woman doesn't produce healthy eggs herself, someone else is donating the egg, and it gets fertilized by usually the husband's sperm. Okay, so that's egg donors, 1983. 1984, 1986, there's new versions of IVF called GIFT and ZIFT, which we'll go into, which most people have never heard of. Okay, so that's another version of IVF, somewhere in the middle between IVF and IUI. What happens in IVF is that the egg is removed from the mother, the sperm comes from the husband, the egg is fertilized in the lab, it grows a bit in the lab, and then is placed, once it reaches a certain number of cells, after 3 to 5 days, it gets placed back in the mother and pregnancy. In GIFT and ZIFT, it's somewhere in the middle, we'll get to that a bit later. It's some middle process. Then 1985, we have the interesting concept of surrogacy, which opens up a whole new can of worms in terms of halacha, right? Where the mother can't hold the baby herself, so we have a surrogate mother who essentially holds the baby, who develops the baby and gives birth to the baby, and then lots of shilas as to who the mother is, and we'll get to that a bit later also. Then we have 1986, we have cryopreservation. Suddenly now you can freeze fetuses, put them in the freezer for some time, defrost them.
The eggs of the fetuses.
The fetuses. Yeah. Well, you can do eggs also. But in the case of IVF, things like that, it's usually it
would be an embryo.
An embryo, yes. An embryo, not really a fetus at that point. Right, embryo. And it's frozen and then put in the microwave, just joking. Defrosted later and then placed and then placed back at a later date. Okay?
You can really do that and have a healthy baby?
Yes,
and give
absolutely.
birth to a baby?
Absolutely.
Wow.
That's been developed. It started the first live baby in 1986.
Not
Okay?
only that, there's custody fights. Couples have embryos frozen, then they get divorced.
Right? And these are all major halacha issues. What happens if a husband dies and there's something frozen? What happens now? What happens if yibum chalitza? We're not going to touch on everything because that's not possible. We're going to deal with the main issues here. There's a lot of very interesting issues here. Finally, in 1986, we have something called PGD. Again, PG stands for pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. That means if you're already taking out the egg and the sperm and you're fertilizing them in the lab, hey, let's check it for genetic diseases before we put it back to make sure it's healthy. So for people who have certain genetic, either recessive or other conditions, you test it and put only the healthy ones back. So there's a whole list, why this is called assisted reproductive technologies.
My wife tests for that. Not that she checks for that.
She checks for that. There's a whole list of different technologies that are involved here. And we have to deal with all of these in terms of halacha. And we're going to start from the beginning, obviously. So the beginning actually is not in the 18th century. Professor Steinberg claims that the first reference to anything which is outside of non-in vivo fertilization, it's outside of the, well, it's not really, in this case it's not really outside the mother, but anything which happens outside of the mother is really in Shas. There's no other reference to it until the 13th century when there's a Muslim reference to it, but the first one is in Shas, and this is where we start with our Mari Makomos here. The Gemara in Chagiga, number one here, the Gemara in Chagiga tells us a very interesting question. Shaluas ben Zoma, this is Chagiga Yudal Zoma base. Shaluas ben Zoma, they asked ben Zoma, Besula, She'ibra. Oh, another sheep, sorry. Try again.
You need it? You got it?
Okay. So the Gemara says, Sha'olis ben Zoma, that's ben Zoma, Besula She'ibra, a Besula that got pregnant. Mahu leKohen Gadol. Can she marry a Kohen Gadol? We know a Kohen Gadol can only marry someone who's a Besula. So she's pregnant. Now we're going to go into Christianity here a bit for a second. Okay? So how did she get pregnant? She's a Besula. What's going on? So mi chayshinon l'Shmuel. Are we going to be choshesh for Shmuel? So Amar Shmuel, because Shmuel said, Yochel ani liv'ol kama be'ilos below dam. I can technically have physical relations with a woman and not make her lose a Besulim, essentially. So in theory, she could be a Be'ula even though she still has Besulim. Should we be choshesh for that and say she's asa to marry a Kohen Gadol? She's pregnant after all. Should we assume that she is a Be'ula and therefore she's asa to Kohen Gadol? Or Dilma, perhaps the Shmuel lo shchicha. Perhaps Shmuel, being able to do such a feat is not considered to be a likely thing. We don't have to be choshesh. She can marry the Kohen Gadol. So it says the Gemara, Amalhu. So the Gemara says the Shmuel lo shchiach. No, Shmuel, that's not likely. The chayshinon shema ba'ambati ibra. And what we assume happened here is that she got pregnant through an ambati, through a bathhouse. How did she get pregnant through a bathhouse? What does that mean? So Rashi says, simple pshat, she was kli shirochtin bokol aguf. She was in a bathhouse or in a bathtub. V'yesh lo ma sheitech sham adam shichva zera v'niches me'me'eha. Perhaps someone went bathed before her, and he released. He had an emission of semen in the water, and somehow she got pregnant from that. She came in straight afterwards, and somehow she got pregnant from that. I remember again when I learned this Gemara, being in yeshiva, and people saying, that can't really happen. Chazal didn't know what they're talking about. So I actually decided to Google this and find out whether this is even possible. The Mishnah Lamelech, by the way, says this is not possible. The Gemara doesn't really mean it can happen. Mishnah Lamelech has a whole piece on this that it's not really possible. Actually, in theory, if semen were to be released in warm water, obviously without chlorine, we're not talking about a swimming pool, it could stay viable for a few minutes. So in theory, extremely unlikely, but in theory possible. Extremely unlikely, but in theory possible. So that's what the Gemara says. This is concept of somehow being pregnant without having physical relations, where the semen got released to the outside, and somehow the woman got pregnant from that. So this is our first example of something happening outside of regular marital relations and a woman becoming pregnant. Okay? So we're going to start our halachic discussion from number 3. So now the Chalkas Mekochek, who is one of the primary Nosei Kelim on Even HaEzer, asked the following question. Yesh li stapik. He says, Yesh li stapik, I have a big question. Isha shenis'aber ba'ambati. If she got pregnant this way, in other words, not through marital relations, in kiyem ha'av pru'uvu, has the husband been mekayim pru'uvu, and is it considered to be his son? Interesting question. Let's say a person did have this unlikely scenario. Is it the husband's son? And has he been therefore mimikayim through uvu? Two questions which are related, obviously.
It's very relevant to us.
Well, that's why we're mentioning it. So, how is this related to him? Is this child related to him or not? Now, notice the Chalkas Mekochek doesn't explain what his question is exactly. He says, I have a question. He doesn't explain why yes and why no. What is the reason for us not to assume that he would be his baby? What is the reason not? So we're going to get into that in a second. What is the question exactly?
I can go such as far as, but I think you'll do that.
Okay, we're going to get to. There's a couple of possibilities here, which I'm sure you're thinking of yourself. Right? What is exactly the problem? If it's his child, it's his child. What's the problem? Okay? So he quotes V'likutei Maharil, the Likutim of the Maharil, the late Rishon, the Maharil, the Ashkenazi Rishon. Nimtza sheben Sira, the Likutim Maharil Nimtza, in the writings of the Maharil, he brings this very interesting case. Sheben Sira haya b'no shel Yirmiyahu. Ben Sira, who was one of the Sfarim that didn't make it into Tanakh, okay, Sfarim Chitzonim as it's known. So Ben Sira was the ben of Yirmiyahu. He was somehow the son of Yirmiyahu. How was that? Sherachat ba'ambati. somehow he was the son of Yirmiyahu through exactly this case. Yirmiyahu was in a bathhouse, and somehow we're assuming for a second, his wife became pregnant with his son this way. Ki Sira, the word Sira, is the gematria of Yirmiyahu. Very interesting. So Ben Sira, that means he came from Yirmiyahu. So this exact case happens. What is this story? So I actually found the Likutei Maharil, and interesting story here. It's a bit different than what you would assume. The story goes like this. The Bas Yirmiyahu, it was actually the daughter of Yirmiyahu who went into the bathtub after Yirmiyahu. The Kala Zera Aviha, and she became pregnant from Yirmiyahu through his semen. V'nisabra, v'yalda. Everyone agreed that chas v'shalom, it wasn't incest here. Must have been this way. The whole denolad miklita zera b'li tashmish zera. So they used to call him Ben Zera. That was originally his name, Ben Zera. Now you can't possibly have anything more insulting than to call Ben Zera. 1 second. Ben Zera. Gadal, and he grew up with Nisiadolo, and he found out, sorry Ben Zera, we have a story to tell you. We've got to tell you what happened and how you were born. All right, when he found out and they had that discussion, Hayabosh Mishmo, understandably he was embarrassed with his name, V'havchu Shmo likra Ben Sira. And they changed his name to Ben Sira, the Gematria Yirmiyahu. Okay?
What's the source for this?
So what's the source for this? The source for this is Agada in Ben Sira. That's in Sefer Ben Sira, supposedly. This is Agada that says such a thing. Okay, I haven't seen it. Ben Sira is a sefer, it's one of the Sfarim HaChitzonim. It's one of the Sfarim that didn't make it into Tanakh. There's a whole list of them. That didn't make it into Tanakh. Chazal didn't canonize it because they didn't feel it was appropriate for Tanakh.
Like Sefer Maccabim?
Exactly, things like that. Sefer Maccabim.
Do we have a copy of it today?
Yes, you can get it, yeah.
How do we know if it's authentic?
All these are valid questions. Can you use this as Halacha, which the Achronim discussed? But this is, regardless of how authentic or how much we can use this to Halacha, the Maharil mentions this Ben Sira as being the son of Yirmiyahu. He was the son of Yirmiyahu, i.e., so we want to say, says the Chalkas Makor, okay, we see from here that if you were to get pregnant through an ambati, even though there's no physical relations, it's considered to be your child, and it's not mamzer, not considered.
Why isn't he mamzer?
Why would he be a mamzer?
It's a relationship.
In the case you're saying about his daughter.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll get to that some other time, which is the whole interesting question of using someone else's zera, someone else's semen for insemination. We'll get to that much later, okay? But not for today. Great question. But you see at least that it's considered the son of Yirmiyahu. You see that the fact that this happened, it's not like we say, okay, no relationship because you didn't have physical relations or something like that. It's considered the son of Yirmiyahu. So the Vefel Chekas Mechokek says, okay, you see from Ben Sira that anything like this, it's related to you, it's your son, your Yotzi Pruv, it would seem. The Beis Shmuel says, number 5, the Beis Shmuel, another of the Nosei Kelim on Evan Ezra, says exactly that. He brings a Chekas Mechokek who has his suffix. Again, we don't know what the suffix is exactly. Why would it not be considered his son? Why would it be problematic? We don't know. He didn't explain. But he brings another riot from another Gemara, not from another Gemara, from one of the Rishonim, the Hagas Asmak, the Sefer Mitzvot Katan. And this is actually a well-known halacha which comes up in many different places, which we're going to quote in many different ways. Isham was heres. A woman should be careful. She shouldn't lie down on a blanket or sheet that another man lay on it. In case you'll get pregnant.
Wait, where are you?
Number 5, in the middle. In case you'll get pregnant from the shichva zera, from the semen of another person. Gzeira, shema yisa achoso me'aviv. In case he won't realize and he will marry his sister from his father. In other words, very bizarre. It seems a very bizarre thing. You shouldn't lie down on a blanket that someone else, another man, lay on. A woman shouldn't, in case you'll get pregnant from that, and then she won't realize that the child is really this other person's, and in case her real child will marry sister, essentially marries her sister. So you see from this that he's beno l'chol davar. You see from here that if you were to get pregnant from such a bizarre situation, it's considered to be you're considered related. That's what the Hagasmak says, that you might marry your sister, or you might marry your if the woman got pregnant and had a girl, you might end up marrying your sister because you weren't aware that your mother became pregnant from somebody else, and therefore you might end up marrying your sister.
So how does it?
Very bizarre situation, but you see from that if that were to happen, that is your child.
Interesting. So this is a real concern nowadays with...
Which one? This one?
With sperm donors.
Yes.
That there isn't a sexual relationship.
100%, and that's one of the big issues, which again we'll get to a bit later. Okay, so finally the Taz says, well, let's leave the Taz for now.
But it seems to contradict Ben Sira.
Why does contradict Ben Sira?
Okay.
So in the case of Ben Sira, we said that if the person would get pregnant...
We just know we get pregnant through the father. So you're just saying you're worried about... Now we know who the father is in this case.
Well, in this case...
We don't know who the father is.
Right. Well, we're going to get to that in a second, right, in the case of Ben Sira.
Maybe
Right.
I'm misunderstanding. In the beginning, are we saying that a woman who gets impregnated from the bathtub,
Yeah. She can assume that
can she marry the Kohen Gadol?
It seems from the Gemara in Chagiga that yes.
So if that's the case, then... Okay.
It would seem from the Gemara in Chagiga, yes. So the question is, does that mean that it's her child and it's the person, whoever seemed his child, even though they didn't have physical relations? So it seems from here, the Taz says it's a suffix, whatever, we're not going to go into the Taz for a second. What is the question here? So what is the question? Why would it not be okay? So Rabbi Yaakov Emden, in Shelas Yavitz, he brings down a very interesting, and again, I'm not going to go through all of this inside. I'm not going to read all of this inside. There's a lot inside here. He says the question is very simple. What the Chalkas Mekokek is asking is very simple, essentially. We know that in order to become a mitzvah, any mitzvah we do, you do an act. You have a lulav, you shake lulav, right? You shake lulav, you say Baruch Hashem Al Netilas Lulav, and you shake your lulav. That is your Maisa mitzvah. That is your mitzvah. That is how you mekayim the mitzvah. You blow shofar. Someone blows the shofar. You hear the shofar. You whatever other examples. We don't need to go through the entire mitzvahs here, right? So you eat matzah. You eat matzah. You do an act. What is the act? What is the act that you're doing when you in order to be mekayim pruvu?
Pay spokesperson.
Well, that's later. No, what is the act to be mekayim pruvu? So physical relations is the act to be mekayim pruvu. Here in the case of Ambati, what act did you do? What act did you do? We hold that mitzvos tzrichos kavana, he says. When you're doing in the act, you have to have kavana. When you say Shema, you have to have kavana. When you eat matzah, you have to kavana that you're eating matzah. Right? When you have to kavana that you listen to the shofar. That's the whole sugya in Rosh Hashanah, right? If you heard the shofar and you didn't have kavana, are you yotzei or not? In this case, she became pregnant totally haphazardly. He had no kavana.
He had no kavanah, but he did have an act.
Well, I mean, technically, yes, but not an act that was with kavana to make her pregnant. And therefore, says Yaakov, and that is what the Chalkas Mekokek question is. How can you possibly say you're yotzei pruvu without doing anything, having any kavana to have a child?
So if somebody has a child and it doesn't have in mind the shem mitzvah pruvu, then he didn't fulfill the mitzvah.
So he goes into that. And
That's the whole question about what kavana is for mitzvah.
Right, exactly. He goes into what kavana you need to have. So the kavana is, you at least have the kavana that you're having the relations. Here, this is totally like random, extremely unlikely at that, totally random, and therefore that is not enough of a kavana to say that that this is not your mitzvah. So even if it were to be your child, because technically it's your sperm, you're not mekayim the mitzvah, he says. You're not mekayim pruvu. Because you didn't do anything with the kavana. There's no kavana. There's no ma'aser mitzvah with kavana. Therefore, that is what the Chalkas Mekokek's question is. And he says, you're not yotzei pruvu. And he gives an example, a very interesting example. Lot. How did Lot impregnate his two daughters?
Drunk.
He was absolutely drunk. Right. We hold that someone is shiko k'shichusho shalot. He's not mekayim mitzvahs. Right, there's a whole question how you say, can you daven on Purim, depending on how drunk you are, right? So we pass him, Birkas Hamazon you're allowed to bench, because that's a normal thing, I guess, at the end of a meal that you drink, so that's a normal thing. It's part and parcel of the meal that it's okay that you're drunk. You're yotzei that. But you shouldn't daven if you're drunk. You shouldn't daven Mari if you're totally plastered on Purim, right? Because you're not Yotzei. Okay, you're not Yotzei. Besides the fact you shouldn't have one, you're drunk, but you're not Yotzei. Okay, so he claims a very interesting thing. Lot, when he had two daughters, when he impregnated his two daughters, he says the first daughter that he impregnated, he was not Yotzei Peruvu through her. Did he even have to be Yotzei Peruvu? That's not the point.
Well, he already had kids. I mean,
Well, he didn't have. He had daughters. He didn't have sons. So was he Yotzei Peruvu? So he says the first daughter he was definitely not Yotzei Peruvu. He didn't know what was going on. Okay, after the first daughter, he should have known already. So he says by the time the second daughter came along, he was already a willing party. And therefore, he says maybe he was Yotzei Peruvu with the second daughter. But the first one, because he had no kavanah, he was totally plastered, totally drunk, he's not Yotzei. There's no kavanah. There's no kavanah of a normal sane person. You can say it's Peruvu. Very interesting point. And he says furthermore, if you, in theory, were to get, a person would get to get their wife pregnant when he was totally asleep. I don't know how you would do that. When he was totally asleep, you're not Yotzei Peruvu. That's what he writes. No kavanah. Very interesting point. So according to him, the issue with the ambati is not a issue of no technical issue whether you're the father. He said maybe he is the father, but you cannot be Yotzei Peruvu because there is no act, there's no intention, there's no intent to have a child, no intent to have physical relations in a normal way. Therefore, you're not Yotzei Peruvu. On the other hand, there's another sefer, which is on the other side here, called the Bnei Ahuva. Bnei Ahuva was written by Yonason Eibeshitz, and it's a parish on the Rambam. And he writes a very interesting, he says, what's the problem with the Sambati? He says, it's not because of Kavanah and Peruvu and whatever else. He says, very simple. We don't know who the father is. How do we know who the father is? Now you have to remember, let's just step back for a second. In the olden days, a bathhouse had lots of people in the bathhouse. People came in and out of bathhouses. So how do we know? He says, how do we know that he's really the father? Perhaps it's somebody else that came in and out. How do we know? In other words, the question is really, is it your child? Is it really your child? It might not actually be your child, in the case of the ambati. It might not be your child. It could be someone else's for all we know, he says. And if it's not your child, then obviously you're not Yotzei Peruvu. Now you could say, let's do a testing. Let's do testing, right? Let's do testing. So that's a whole different question, which hopefully we'll get to one time. What is the relevance, or how far do we take genetic testing, this type of genetic testing, paternity tests in Halacha? It's an interesting question in of itself. That's nowadays. But definitely in the olden days, there was no way of knowing. You know, it came out from it came from externally. How do you know it's really the father? So he says that's the suffix of the Chekas Mevorkeh, and he says
that's why Judaism was with the mother.
And a Chanami, 100%, and a Chanami. He says, therefore, in the case of Ambati, he holds, you're not Yotzei. And it's not your son, and you're not Yotzei. Because until we can prove that it's your son, it's not, we don't know, it's a suffix at least. Yeah.
More modern times, if someone's wife is on birth control, and they have relations,
okay.
it doesn't always work 100%.
For sure. Every birth control is different.
You don't have attention for it. Negative.
So back to Yaakov Emden, he writes, as long as you had intent of the act, even though you didn't have intent, that's enough. Right. But in the case of the Ambati, you didn't have intent for anything, essentially. Right. So, I mean, he goes through that a bit. And it's like we mentioned before, it's a good question of how much intent do you need in order for any mitzvah, really? You know, do you have to, like you're listening to shofar, you have to go like this in order to kavana? Or is it enough that you're just listening? Even if you have to be thinking about a baseball game at the same time. Right?
What do we say about standard IVF today? Like,
well, we're building into that.
Jumping the gun. Sorry.
You're jumping the gun. It's okay, but that's okay. We're going to go straight into that in a second. So that is the suffix. Two possibilities. One, the suffix is it even your child? That's the Bnei Ahuva, Rav Yonason Eibeshitz. Possibility two, what the suffix was, perhaps it really is your child. Perhaps it is. But even if it's your child, perhaps you're not Yotzei Peruvu because you had no intent. No kavanah. Mitzvah tzrichas kavanah, no kavanah. Okay? So those are the two possibilities here. It's interesting. The Minchas Chinuch holds that in order to have children, you don't actually have to have really kavanah of a mitzvah at all. He says that, and he's a unique opinion. He says the pruvu is not, the mitzvah pruvu is not the act of impregnating. That is not the mitzvah approval. As opposed to, if you look here, he says, the mitzvah zu eina kashar mitzvah lulav u'matzah v'domehem. It's not like lulav u'matzah where you do an act and that is your mitzvah. That's not the mitzvah. The mitzvah approval is having a child. The time when you mekayim the mitzvah is when you actually have the child and the child grows up. So it's nothing to do with the act.
So if you adopt a boy and a girl, are you mekayim the mitzvah for revolt?
It's a good question. Good question. I mean, technically you're probably not, because it's not your child, biologically. But it's a good question.
But according to, if you're saying
It says the point is having the child. So, doing the act of physical relations isn't the mitzvah, like lulav, when you shake lulav. The mitzvah is only when you actually have the child and they grow up and have their own children. That is the mitzvah. Because, the mitzvah is that your children grow up and also have children. That is, and if you're in Halacha.
I just saw a chazal, a gemara in Megillah that says, Divrei Yamim says that Bas Paro gave birth to Moshe.
Right.
And they asked her that she didn't give birth to him.
Right.
They say that anyone who raises a
child, it's like that, 100%. But does that mean it's like that to the extent that you're Yotzei Peruva? Right. So that's really the question. Okay. So according to him, it wouldn't make a difference whether you had kavana at that time. If you had the child, that is the ikar the mitzvah. Okay. But those are the two mahalchim. Let's move over to IUI. Okay. This week we're going to do with IUI, and then we'll move next week to IVF. So what about IUI? So the first person who deals with this again in the 19th century is a Shud Divrei Malkiel. Divrei Malkiel lived in the 19th century, early 20th century in Europe, and he's dealing with, as I mentioned, that's when IUI, what we call artificial insemination, started. And he deals with the shaila, is it considered to be your child or not? And he writes, after going through a long piece here, and there's lots of different pieces here, I'm just going to go through this very briefly. This is number 11 on the sheet. He writes, let's skip for a second. Just to the third line. Shroferis is artificial insemination, sort of a
tube, no?
A tube, yeah, I guess when they inject the semen in. So he writes, yes, it is your child. After all, it's your seed. It's your seed. But he writes, but is it mutter to do such a thing? This is the next question. Let's say it is your child now. Is it mutter? Why would it not be mutter? Why would it not be mutter? If you look at the third paragraph, he starts off saying the following, and this is really the most important piece here. Maybe it's asur. So even if technically you're yotzei, but is it the right thing to do?
Shroferis, is that the uterus?
The shroferis is whatever pipette or whatever they're using to inject the semen. So habashas ma'isa hu motzi levatala. First of all, in order to do this, you have to be motzi zera levatala. He writes, right? The husband has to spilling seed. Okay, that's exactly what we're going to discuss now. 100%. But he says it's levatala. You're somich on the doctor who's going to use it properly and inject it properly. Can you rely on doctors? Okay. Okay, so the whole big interesting halacha. We'll get to this in a second. Skip to the next piece. Perhaps he's going to take the semen and he's going to try and use it, and something will go wrong. Oops, dropped it. Perhaps the doctor will say, sorry, do it again.
It happens.
It happens, right? And he writes, this happens. Doctors are just humans. It happens. They make mistakes also. So for sure it's Zeh Levatala. Okay? Skip to the next column. And perhaps not only that, the doctor's going to be conniving in order to make his statistics go up and get into the news, the news report, whatever. He's going to try and up his statistics and use his own sperm to make her pregnant and tell her, oh, it's your child. No, it's your child. But he's going to use his own semen. How can you assume? We have to be choshesh that someone's going to switch.
And when is this Divrei Malkiel from?
Divrei Malkiel, this is from the end of the 19th century in Europe. This is when this started happening. This first technology IUI started. That's insemination. So he writes lots of reasons why it's a problem, and therefore his maskana is we're not supposed to be so smart and so sophisticated. asher yizake osam bezer shel kayama. Okay, etc., etc. So he is the source to say IUI is usher. It's usher to do it, even if it's your son and even your child, and even if you're Yotzei Peruvu, you're not allowed to do it. And he gives a couple of reasons. So there's really two main reasons. One is that Hotzas Zera Levatala in different ways. And two is, how do you know, once someone else is involved, how do you know that it's really yours?
Yeah, but we have Machon Puat.
1 second, okay. How do you know it's really yours? Didn't have a deck then, that's true. How do you know it's really yours? Right? Perhaps the doctor... Now you think that's far-fetched. Oh boy, is it not far-fetched. I just want to give you a couple of examples.
It's not.
I'll give you 3 stories. One in Virginia in 1992. There was a doctor, fertility clinic in Fairfax, Virginia, who a couple of people got a bit suspicious when they noticed some of their children looking alike. Different people went to the clinic, and they discovered that for many years he had been using his own sperm to fertilize, to inseminate, to impregnate women. And he had told, obviously, the husbands that it was theirs. And he was doing it himself. He went to jail, for sure. Then there was another case in Indiana, the same thing. I think they said he had over 600 children. Well, they were doing paternity tests, and slowly but surely going through the records. And there was a case in England, the same thing happened.
Okay, but the fact that you could tell me those cases.
Yeah.
So out of the 1,000 fertility
so you're going to say
clinics,
Rove is not happening.
So you have 3 examples out of the last 20 years of thousands of doctors.
No.
The ones which are known, exactly. So so the point here is, yes, you're 100% Rove. No one's saying that Rove is not a problem, but his concerns are very legitimate.
Yeah.
But they are legitimate in that it can happen, but there's governmental controls, there is oversight. These doctors or whomever were committed this were punished.
Let me speak about an article that came out last week. I read it last week. I'm not sure it came out last week. It might have been a bit earlier. 2 articles I read from England that went through the statistics of mistakes in IVF laboratories through England.
I'm talking about Western medicine, like real medicine.
Ooh, wow.
Okay, that's why you have to.
It's actually quite frightening how many people are. Oops, we put the wrong baby in you. Oops,
That's why I have proper. My wife worked in IVF at Shaare Zedek. They had a mashgiach.
Yeah.
In the lab, they're from Mechon Puah.
Right, 100%. We're going to get to that. So my point here is that the Divrei Malkiel's concerns, at least this one, is a very legitimate concern. And his other question is it Hotzas Zera Levatala at this first stage before? That's a whole different question which we need to get to. The Marsham, we have 5 more minutes? Okay, we have 5 more minutes. The other contemporary to the Divrei Malkiel was the Maharsham, okay, from Brezhnev. And he also was asked the same question. Is it mutter to do this? Is it mutter to do it? And he writes, he doesn't think it's, you definitely have to be careful. We have to make sure that we know that it's really there's someone looking after this. You need to have 2 doctors, at least here in number 12. You used to have at least 2 doctors to be mashgiach. It's not enough to have 1 doctor in charge. You have to have a second opinion, right? Yeah. Not yichud. Yeah, whatever. You have to have a second opinion, second doctor to make sure that it's okay. That's the first. Secondly, he says, I'm only being matured if someone didn't have children for 10 years. Now, because it's b'diavad, it's questionable because of Zera and everything else. Only if someone is, unfortunately, doesn't have children for 10 years, where there's a question of shalom bayis already, a question of divorce, a question of a couple separating, a family falling apart, then he was matured. And then, even then, only if other rabbanim would be maskim with him. So these are the first tshuvas. Divrei Malkiel, who's totally oser doing anything like this, versus the Marasham, who's matir under certain conditions.
This is early 1900s?
We're talking about end of the 19th century, early 20th century.
Okay, so early 19th?
Right.
I mean,
No,
20.
20.
What's that?
Early 19, yes, 100%. 1900s, yeah.
Early 1900s?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So these are the first. So here you have 2 schools already. You can imagine that there were many people who actually followed Divrei Malkiel. For example, the Chazon Ish. Chazon Ish said artificial insemination, what we call IUI Aser. Okay? Not just the Chazon Ish, the Brisker Rav. Aser. Basically, based on the premises, the reasons of the Divrei Malkiel. there's a lot of problems here. This is not as simple as it seems. A, the hashgacha. B, how do we know that it's being done properly? And as I said, there are many, many documented cases of where things have gone wrong, either intentionally or not intentionally. That's A. B, is there a question of Hotzas Levatal? Even if you are to assume it's your child and everything else, is there an issue?
I don't think there's any postscript today that say you can.
We'll get to that.
Okay.
We'll get to that. There are.
Okay.
There are. Again, assuming that certain conditions are not met, which is where we get into a lot of other things. Okay. Finally, just to end off today, number 13, the Minchas Yitzchak, who again is a bit later, he says IUI is fine, artificial insemination is fine, as long as you have the hashgacha again, as long as you have some form of hashgacha. So what about what Rav Yonasan Eibeshit said, that it's not your child, maybe it's not your child? What about what Rav Yaakov Emden said, there's no kavana, mitzvah tzrichas kavana. He says, when you're doing IUI, there's no bigger kavana that you can possibly have when you're going through fertility treatments. Of course you have kavana. This is not ambati. This is not something which is haphazard that happened randomly. You're going in to have a child. So therefore that's a kavana. So the concern of Yaakov Emden, as far as ambati, it doesn't apply. The concern of Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshit, his contemporary, right, who said, maybe it's not your child, we don't know. Well, that doesn't apply either, he says. In an ambati, maybe people came in and out. There's a concern there. Who knows whose sperm it is? Okay? Maybe there's a concern there. But when we're dealing in a lab, which is done properly, and there's no people walking in and out and just moving things around, there's nothing to be concerned there as long as you have, again, 2 rofim and things like that. So that is the consensus as far as the Minchas Yitzchak and the Marsham, that it's mutter to do such a thing. Next week we'll continue to discuss the people say it could be problematic for other reasons and move into IVF.
What do you